All right, good evening. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I am Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies here at Gonzaga University, where I direct our Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. Thank you for being here for our latest in our lecture series this semester. I'd like to also begin with a brief acknowledgement that we reside on the ancestral lands of the Spokane tribal people, the people of the river. This is a fun way of depicting those historical areas that the different tribes in our state used to inhabit. Our university wouldn't exist if it wasn't for some of the local tribes inviting Jesuits to this area in order to start a university, and then we owe them a great debt. Our event this evening is hosted by the new Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment, which was founded by an abiding interest to help our community to understand and respond to the urgent crisis that is climate change. And this event is part of that series of events to try and understand and respond to that challenge. Before we get going on our event tonight, I wanted to mention that we have a couple of more events coming up. The most recent is at the end of Earth Week, actually on Earth Day and the day after. There's a regional conference being held at St. John's Cathedral up on South Hill, co-hosted by Whitworth University, St. John's Cathedral, and the Gonzaga Climate Center are hosting this two-day conference, Hope for Creation. And so you can go aim your camera there at the QR on the screen and register for that if you are in the area. And then this summer, it's a little ways away, but it's a really great event with Dr. Herman Daly, famous economist, founder of ecological economics. We'll be having a virtual talk available to people anywhere in the world on July 13th. And so consider registering for that as well. And then during our event, because this is a live stream, not a Zoom, there's no easy way for people who are at home, wherever you are in the world. Hello. Miss you here tonight. But if you'd like to pose a question for the Q&A period at any time during the talk, go ahead and just write an email to climatecenter@gonzaga.edu, and I'll try and keep an eye on my email, and we could perhaps pose a few of those questions from people at home. And now to introduce actually our speaker, I'd like to first introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. John Isaacoff, who's Professor of Environmental Studies here at Gonzaga University and the founding chair of our Environmental Studies and in Sciences program here. If you're an environmental studies or science student, you have Dr. Isaacoff to thank for having created that program. He is a scholar of Arab-Israeli conflict and as well as teaching on environmental politics for the Environmental Studies Department. It's my great pleasure to invite him up tonight. Dr. Isaacoff.
Thank you, Brian, for that very kind introduction. I, too, would like to thank the Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment, the Gonzaga Environmental Studies Department, and the Faculty Senate Speakers Committee for their sponsorship of this event. So it is my pleasure to introduce also a friend and colleague, Dr. Karen Litfin, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. She's been teaching global environmental politics since 1991. Dr. Litfin's books include Ozone Discourses, Science and Politics in Global Environmental Cooperation, published with the Columbia University Press, The Greening of Sovereignty, published by the MIT Press, and Eco-Villages, Lessons for Sustainable Community with Polity Press. In both her research and teaching, she endeavors to integrate the intellectual, emotional, and practical dimensions of sustainability. As you know, her talk this evening is entitled Becoming Planetary, From the Personal to the Political. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Litfin.
Yeah, no worries.
No, but I think you'll just
I have my mouse.
yeah.
Can you hear me okay? How's the volume, Brian? Or what's his name, Nick? Is it good? Okay. Awesome. Well, great to be with you all today. And thanks so much, John, for bringing me out, and also to Brian. John and I met in the fall of 2016 at the Whidbey Institute, where we were doing a curriculum for the bioregion, was doing a workshop on contemplative teaching, mostly around sustainability. And we were actually meeting the weekend after the 2016 election, so emotions were high and we had a lot to process. And that was actually a wonderful meeting, and we've gotten back in contact with one another in recent months, and that's brought me here. So I feel a little rusty. I've done lots of public speaking, but I'm very aware that you all wear masks and I'm not, and I'm really glad I'm not. But I haven't been doing much public speaking, so I might be a little rusty. And I just want to say I also have a strong affinity for Jesuit universities. I was raised Catholic, but my father's Jewish, so I have kind of both sides. And somehow I've never gotten to Gonzaga, so it's just great to be here. And I'm really happy that it's the Center for Climate Science and Society, or Society and Environment, that brings me here, because as I read the website and get a sense of what's happening through the center here, actually it seems to me that the center is a really good example of what it means to become planetary, to actually understand ourselves as planetary beings and work within a local context with that understanding, always with the global picture in mind at the same time. And also that the center recognizes that the great work of our era is to transition, this is from the website, to transition from a period of planetary devastation to a new era of symbiotic Earth-human relationships. And I do agree that that's the great work of our time, and I see here also the fingerprint of Thomas Berry, the wonderful Jesuit cultural historian. So I feel a real resonance with this place and the mission of this place here. And I also want to acknowledge that this transition is going to be a bumpy ride. And it already is a bumpy ride. And that's part of what I want to bring to the talk, is a kind of a sense of how can we go on this bumpy ride with as much ease and grace as possible, and solidarity, and knowing that it's going to be a difficult transition. And it's going to be a transition that I'm so certain is going to outlast me, and most likely outlast all of us in this room. So what we're talking about is a real civilizational shift, if we make it as a civilization. So tonight I hope to give you a sense of what it means to actually reinvent the human. There's another phrase from Thomas Berry. What it means to reinvent the human from a scientific, political, and social, and even a visceral place. So by now, we're all so familiar with this image. But I remember as a young girl when it was being broadcast from NASA space orbit, and it was new and it was amazing, to actually see the Earth from outer space, and we take it for granted now. But even that Earth from space image, it gives us a sense. You can't actually see nation-state boundaries on this photograph. And the implicit message is that we are one species inhabiting one Earth. And astronomers, universally, no matter what country they're from, they experience something called not astronomers, astronomers maybe, but astronauts in particular, they experience something called the overview effect. And that's the sense of getting the distance from the Earth, seeing the Earth as a whole living system, really, and having the sense of, wow, this is a fragile and amazing single planet that's enveloped by an atmosphere and is moving around in a black darkness of outer space. So we mostly tend to focus on what divides us, but in actuality, there's a whole lot that unites us, and we are one species. And I think part of becoming planetary is becoming human and recognizing ourselves as actually being one species. So yeah, and actually just to take a second and just notice what comes to you in this image. Like, maybe it's boring, like you've seen it so many times. Maybe it's inspiring. Maybe it feels abstract and remote. But this is, it's something that technology has brought us, and it's ubiquitous now. Practically every human being on the planet in some way or another has seen some image of the Earth from space. But let's backtrack. Let's backtrack actually before human history to human migration. So I'm going to kind of make the case that while we're going to talk a lot tonight about globalization, then in a sense, human beings, humanity has become a kind of global species over a long period of time. So this is the, Homo sapiens is the red line coming out of southern Africa, moving up into Asia, Eurasia, Europe, and eventually over into the, quote, New World. This is pre-colonial. You would say these are the first humans moving in these directions. So this goes back over 100,000 years. So now we were not, where people settled, they were not aware necessarily of one another globally the way we are today. But we are, you could say we're a kind of invasive species, you know, that's been globalized. And it's remarkable. We have actually managed to inhabit every landmass on the planet. So in a sense, we've been kind of making a planetary trajectory from the get-go, you could say. And where that's landed us today is a world of 195 nation states with territorial boundaries, each with their own constitutions, their own laws, their own court systems, governments, etc., currencies, militaries for the most part. And this is the political world. This is the political world that we understand as real, very real, and with very real consequences, but entirely socially constructed. This is not a natural phenomenon, although we can make the argument that, of course, humans are not a natural phenomenon, and so therefore it is. But this was definitely a human connection, a human fabrication. And then, of course, the world that we have geopolitically and politically speaking came to us through a process of globalization that in particular got really ramped up with New World exploration, where the Europeans in particular came into Africa and into eventually into North and South America, bringing with them all kinds of foods in particular. You know, it's sometimes called the Columbian exchange for Christopher Columbus, of course. And you see the vast array of foods coming out of the Americas into Europe and into the, quote, old world, and then some foods coming into the Americas. And so this was a kind of global movement of food. And along with this, a global movement of species, because foods are species. And if you might notice over here, this little emblem also, diseases, part of that as well. So globalization also included globalization of diseases, and we're wearing masks in part because of that issue, right? We are now coming hopefully out of a pandemic, although we don't know, And that's a global phenomenon. It's a planetary phenomenon. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. And so we also have colonialism, conquest, all of this, and the globalization eventually of trade and interdependence, deep interdependence economically. Again, asymmetric in the sense that there's winners and losers to this. So I'm giving you many kind of images of globalization to just kind of paint a broad picture of what an enormous phenomenon that is and how embedded our lives are in that. You know, everything that we touch almost in our lives is a consequence of globalization. All the gadgets, so many from China in particular these days. So we have this globalization of consumption, really. And if we're sitting here in this room, or standing as I am, we are, for the most part, the beneficiaries of this process of globalization. We are able to access global goods in a way that most people in the world simply cannot. Yeah, and just to say a little bit more about the pandemic, also a consequence of globalization. So most likely, though we're not certain, coming from zoonotic origins, coming from animals, and either way, whether it was or wasn't, our numbers, the fact that there's 8 billion of us, that we're deeply interconnected through transportation, through our economics, and the fact that we tend to be urbanized, all of this has made it possible for the virus to replicate and kill at least 6 million people worldwide in the last 2 years, and probably many more than that. That's the recorded deaths. So you can't say this is exactly a planetary phenomenon in that the Earth system is not really being impacted by this, but it is certainly a planetary phenomenon in the sense that it's part of the Earth as a living system, that even this one microbe mutating can actually, in some ways, bring the species to its knees. And at the same time, it's the global network of technology that's brought us vaccines. So it's pretty impressive accomplishment. You know, globalization is a pretty darn impressive accomplishment. And there's consequences to this. And in particular, we are living in an era now in which human beings, human activities, are destabilizing the Earth system as a whole system. So I know that this is a climate center that's brought me here, but I'm going to talk a little bit about other planetary issues as well. So if you look at this diagram, this actually comes out of a well-known piece that came out about 15 years ago that tried to quantify what it would mean for human societies to live within a safe operating space. And so where we're in the green going into yellow, especially going into red, that's when we're outside the boundaries in these different arenas. So if you look at climate change, for instance, climate change is actually that one right there at the top. And we think of that as being the biggest issue, and I would argue, even though it's only one quadrant here, or one segment, it actually is the biggest for a lot of reasons. I won't go into the details of that, but just to say that it's affecting all these other arenas. But if you look at the biosphere, actually, that's where we're the most out of bounds. The phosphorus and nitrogen cycles, in particular because of agriculture, that's where we're also the most out of bounds. So these are planetary issues, and climate change is one of those planetary issues, and probably the foremost one that we'll be facing in our lives because of the consequences. Everything is contained within climate. And this destabilization of the Earth system is goes by the name of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is the idea is that human activity is actually the main ecological force, you can say, on the planet today. So let's see, I'm going to actually jump forward to this slide. So prior to what we are now calling the Anthropocene, which geologists haven't completely agreed that we're in it, but it's a very fruitful term. The thought that our species may actually have tipped and is tipping the balance of the whole Earth system. That we, as one species among most likely millions, could have done this. So this is temperature here, and you see it in between in this relatively, it's fairly small range, and then like really quite at the top here is the Holocene. So we are living in a rare interglacial period. The last 10,000 years in which civilization grew up has occurred during a relatively warm period. And so when we talk about global warming, it's actually tipping us into an even warmer state. So it's kind of a strange irony, I think, that even though we talk about, we're so focused on divisions, political divisions, ethnic divisions, gender divisions, nation-state divisions, all of this, that we've actually achieved a kind of ironic unity as a geophysical force. I mean, the Anthropocene is because human beings are acting as a geophysical force. So we've actually bumped our planet into a new set of parameters. And the consequences of this are going to be playing out not just over our lifetimes, but really, really long past our lifetimes. And one of the most amazing facts, aspects of this is that it was an accident. Like, we didn't mean to create the Anthropocene. We did it as a cumulative, unintended consequence of many actions throughout the industrial era, primarily, and of billions of people. So, in terms of climate change, you can think of it as basically kind of inserting geological timescales by digging up fossil fuels. I mean, they're fossil fuels. That means they're fossils, right? And formed millions of years ago, digging that up and putting it into the atmosphere. So we've essentially pumped geology into the geosphere, into the biosphere, into the atmosphere, into the hydrosphere, into the oceans, where in fact most greenhouse gases have been absorbed. Most carbon dioxide that's been emitted during the industrial era has been absorbed in the oceans. So we see this kind of ramping up, this acceleration of time, really as a consequence of our actions here. So, and I want to return to this slide that I skipped, which is that the term Anthropocene makes it sound like, well, all people have done this. But of course, not all people have done this. It's overwhelmingly the consequence of activity in the industrialized world on the part of the most affluent countries. And in particular, the US has emitted a disproportionate share of the greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide. So this is an ecological footprint map, and carbon footprint roughly maps over to ecological footprint. I actually prefer this in some ways because it speaks to not just climate issues, but also water, land access, et cetera. And so you see in the darker shades that these are the people who have really kind of taken up more than our fair share, you could say, of planetary resources and the capacity of the Earth's atmosphere to absorb wastes. So when we say Anthropocene, we should not be under the illusion that this is all equally caused by all of humanity. And as I said before, if we're here in this room, we are the beneficiaries in many ways of the global economy that's brought us here. Okay. So, one of the great discoveries in the last 50 years or so is that the Earth is actually functioning as a living system. And we've approached the world in the modern era as if it were simply inert and kind of a vast repository of resources for our consumption, and also a vast kind of sink for our wastes and our pollution. But actually the Earth itself it's a living system. So, did you ever have the experience of hiking and you saw something that looked like, say, the sand, but it turned out to be a snake? Or you noticed something that looks like a log, but it's actually a snake? Or you reach for a vine, and I'm using snakes because that's the image here. But you think something's inert, but suddenly it moves and you realize it's alive. And I would say that what's happening to us collectively now is that we're waking up to the fact that we live on a living planet. And so the thing that we thought was inert is not inert. And in fact, it's powerfully alive. And that's both a scary thing and a wonderful thing. And it is a reality. So I'm going to say a little bit here about Earth system science, but the entry point that I want to give you for that is Gaia theory. And this is James Lovelock, one of my favorite scientists. He's the progenitor of Gaia theory, which was originally called the Gaia hypothesis. And he's turning 103 this June. He's still, as far as I know, as of at least last year, very lively. And he was an atmospheric chemist working for NASA in the 70s, in the early 70s. And he was trying to understand whether there was a way to find out whether there was life on Mars without actually going to Mars. And so he was trying to study any atmosphere that might be in Mars, over Mars, and compare it to the Earth's atmosphere, which meant studying the Earth's atmosphere. And one of the things that he discovered is that the Earth's atmosphere is really anomalous. And in fact, the only way to understand and explain the Earth's atmosphere as it exists today is to understand that life itself has made the conditions that are conducive to its own furtherance. In other words, there's no inert atmosphere. The atmosphere is a product in large part of the biosphere. It's actually a product of the interaction of the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the earth system, the water system. And there's all kinds of questions that are raised around Gaia theory, like, does Gaia have innate intelligence? Does Gaia have a purpose? And I'm just going to sidestep all that, although I think it's all really interesting, and then just say that the basic elements of Gaia theory were incorporated over time into what we have today as Earth system science. And it's a way of looking at the Earth as a whole system. And it's not like you only have chemistry, you only have biology, chemistry, atmospheric sciences, oceanography. These are actually all part of an Earth system. So like here at not here, but at the University of Washington where I teach, we had a whole bunch of these colleges and schools folded over into the program on Earth system science. And so it's a really new way of understanding the Earth, that the Earth is a living system. And that I would give James Lovelock a lot of credit for that. So it's basically that living organisms interact with their inorganic surroundings to form a synergistic and self-regulating complex system that helps to perpetuate the conditions for life itself. So, in other words, our lives are inextricably embedded in a living planet. And part of like waking up to the fact of climate change is noticing, this thing that we thought that was inert, it's like the snake in the sand. It's moving, you know. And so wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, extreme weather events, all of this is a consequence of living on a living planet. And so as I was saying, it's both wonderful and potentially frightening. So I'm a social scientist, though. I'm not an Earth system scientist. I'm interested in where humans fit in the Earth system. And my field is international environmental politics and international environmental law. And so where do we fit in this Earth system? And so it's interesting that we are now maybe in the Anthropocene, in which humans are the dominant geophysical force on the planet. And yet, in Earth system science, like, where are we? Where are the people here? Well, you might say, well, we're like the master force behind it all, or we're the bumbling idiots behind it all, or whatever, however you want to portray it. But where are we? So this is a typical kind of diagram for the way Earth system scientists might think of what they study and what they measure in the world. But then I say, where are the people? One of the things that I like to say when, for instance, our university set up the College of the Environment, we have more environmentally oriented courses at the University of Washington probably than any university in the world, because we have all these resource schools, and but there were almost no social scientists involved in the college. And I would say, there aren't any environmental problems. There's only human problems, right? So we really need to be studying people as if we're part of the Earth system, because we definitely are. That's the whole meaning of the Anthropocene, right? I kind of love and hate this cartoon. There's actually a phenomenon called the Goldilocks phenomenon that describes the Earth as neither too hot nor cold, but just right. And was it the little bears who ate it all up in the three bears? And then down here, maybe Mars isn't too cold, which actually some people are really hoping that that's the case and moving towards space exploration. And I'm not going to say anything about that. And then I say, whoops, because it was an accident. This is not, we actually didn't set out to consume the Earth, right? That was not the goal of modern industrial society. It was an unintended consequence, which I think is why we have to start thinking really seriously about our purposes. So getting back to this diagram, where are the people? I want to suggest this term, the noosphere, the sphere of the human mind. And basically, it's where most of us hang out most of the time. And what is the noosphere? It sounds so abstract. But actually, it's like we're the fish in the water of the noosphere, because if you're having a thought, which most of the time people are, particularly modern people, you're in the noosphere. So this talk is part of the noosphere. This came out of the noosphere. Every gadget that we have came out of the noosphere. Every book, every aspect of science and technology, the periodic table of the elements, which is one of my favorite parts of the noosphere, honestly. This, which I referred to before as the world of 195 nation states, that's the noosphere too. The ways that we organize ourselves socially, our family structures, our philosophies, our religions, our sets of values, all of this is part of the noosphere. Our global economy, definitely part of the noosphere, with the governing idea being that the way to run an economy is to move from resource extraction to production to consumption to waste. And then it turns out there's a problem, because in a living system, there actually isn't waste. In a living system, one organism's waste is another organism's food, right? So we have an idea of waste. It's kind of a central idea in our particular noosphere to our industrial culture, waste. Eventually, if we're going to make it as a global species and have a planetary civilization, we're going to have to revise that notion of waste, because it actually doesn't work on a planetary scale. And it doesn't work even in many local scales as well. The idea of growth, infinite growth on the Earth. Well, we have a finite planet. And this actually is from Kenneth Boulding in the mid-60s, so this is not a new idea, that infinite growth on a finite planet is not possible. So if we're going to move in the direction of a planetary economy, then it has to operate within the safe operating space that I was alluding to in my earlier diagram about planetary boundaries. And it's going to also have to take into account issues of justice, gender equity, racial equity, all of this. And I'd be happy to talk to the details of that if you have questions, but I think it's not as if you can really separate global justice from ecological exigencies, because ultimately it's people, and if people are not being treated fairly, there's going to be unrest. So all of this is part of the noosphere. And so the idea of a circular economy is also part of the noosphere. And so knowing that we're waking up to this living planet, one of the things that happens is that we start thinking about the future. And I know a lot of people are thinking about the future, because as humans, that's what we tend to do anyway. But there's a lot of questioning about where are we going. So the Paris Agreement of 2015 set 1.5 degrees Celsius as the goal and said it's doable. But as the UN Secretary General just came out and said yesterday, it's on life support system at this point. It's not. It may not be viable if we don't start moving there quickly. And all of this kind of creates a sense of anxiety about the future, which is also part of the noosphere. So all of our emotional reactions to seeing where we're at is part of the noosphere. And it's actually a part that I think we really need to tend to. Because as things, however we go forward culturally or individually, it's going to depend a lot on our resilience skills. So I'm just curious, we do have a fair number of young people in this room, and anybody raise your hand. If you regularly experience a sense of anxiety about climate change, just raise your hands if you do. And I'd like you to look around and just to see that if you're raising your hand, you're not alone. This is actually where in my experience, and I've been teaching climate politics since 1988, there's really an epidemic of it now, and I think for good reason. There's also climate guilt, I drive too much, I fly too much, I eat meat, whatever, there's climate guilt. There's also climate paralysis, like it's too big, I don't know what to do about it. There's so many emotions associated with all of that, and that's all part of the noosphere as well. So, yeah. So I was looking for a wordle on climate anxiety, and this is what I got. And yeah, I mean, it's, if you pay attention to this stuff on a regular basis, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed. And I'm very interested in tending to that place of overwhelm. I do encounter it with my students quite a lot, And I encounter it in myself as well. So I'm interested in finding the tools to be with the emotional complexity of our times. And also, there's an organization called the Good Grief Network, for instance, that works with climate grief. There's a number of organizations that work with climate doom, et cetera. And to acknowledge that, that a lot has already been lost and more will be lost. And that's real. So that's, all of that can feel paralyzing and overwhelming, but I'm not going to leave you there. Just to acknowledge it. And I think there's something about saying it. In somatic psychotherapeutic work, one of the things that they say is to name it and tame it. That when you can name the intense emotion that you're not really dealing with because it feels too overwhelming, but when you name it, actually simply naming it publicly with others, not just in yourself, but although that can help as well, can really help. And I think part of where we're at is that a lot of these emotions are being held privately, and so there's not the political momentum that would come from people sharing their emotions and then saying, oh, what can we do? Because the nature of emotions is to move us. That's what it means. Emotions are for motion, right? So I said I'm not going to leave you there, and I'm not. I think it's actually helpful to consider past successes. And you might think planetary problems, we don't really have any successes there. Deforestation is getting worse. The biodiversity crisis is getting worse. More and more species are going extinct. You can point to individual successes with particular species. You can definitely point to less urban pollution in many parts of the world, and reforestation in certain parts of the world. But overall, it does seem like things are getting worse. But I want to give you an example of a real success story, and that is the shining example of environmental diplomacy, the Montreal Protocol on the stratospheric ozone layer. And again, unintended consequence, chlorofluorocarbons, they were the miracle compound discovered in the 1930s. And so how could my mother's hairspray, I'm growing up in the 60s, how could my mother's hairspray be causing the Antarctic ozone hole? That's definitely a planetary problem, right? It's totally unintended. Like, my mother is not intending to deplete the Antarctic ozone hole, layer, but she's doing it, as everybody who's using chlorofluorocarbons during this time. And so in the late 80s, we have the Montreal Protocol that's negotiated, and actually it would not have been nearly sufficient. And so almost on an annual basis, that treaty was updated. So it was this cooperation between nation states and corporations and citizens groups and the makers of CSEs and also the users of CSEs, and the race to find substitutes, technological substitutes. And ironically, some of those substitutes happen to be strong greenhouse gases. So actually right now, the strongest movement that we have against, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is the movement to reduce the substitute technologies that came out of the Montreal Protocol that most countries in the world have agreed to and is being implemented. So that's a good thing. So this is the Antarctic ozone hole, and that was discovered. It doesn't show you when it was discovered, but it was discovered in 1985. We wouldn't even know about this if it weren't for our science and technology, probably. So it actually peaked most likely in 2017, and it's eventually being healed. And that's because of international cooperation. So there's a body of international law that saved the ozone layer, which without stratospheric ozone, we don't have terrestrial life. Not just human life, but any terrestrial life. Impossible without the protection from ultraviolet radiation. So, I mean, life like that's not under seas. that's kind of a big deal. And hardly anybody knows about it. So just to say there's a lot of good that's out there that we don't even necessarily commonly know about on a planetary scale that involved international cooperation, even with all the division and the conflict. Yeah, so here's the, if we had no Montreal Protocol, this is global ozone concentration, not just over the Antarctic ozone hole. That's where, so that blue circle that you saw before on the previous slide, that blue circle in 2017, that's how it would have been for the whole planet in 40 years. So that's really remarkable. And so we already have an example of a positive planetary politics on a global scale. That already exists. So I think like just take a breath and say, wow, okay, something good can happen. You know, something good has happened. Yeah, and so all of that might seem rather abstract because most of us have very little to do with formulating international law, although it's good if we support those who do, I think. So what does planetary citizenship look like on the ground? You know, so what I just offered you is a kind of macro perspective on planetary citizenship or planetary politics. But what does it look like at the level of everyday life? And I'm not going to actually go into a lot of detail of what that might look like. I will say that my last book was on the Global Eco-Village Network, and I think it's a really lovely example of planetary politics at the level of everyday life, where systems are integrated. So there's an integration of social and ecological systems. There's this integration of personal and political, integration of local and global. So for instance, the Global Eco-Village Network, very microscopic in the sense that these are intentional communities, small, but there's tens of thousands of them all over the world, and they're globally networked. And I didn't put anything in the talk about this in my slides, but I'm just going to say it. Right now, the Global Eco-Village Network is organizing eco-villages across Europe to help Ukrainians who are fleeing from the war to resettle into eco-villages. And so again, it's a global network, locally based, but globally linked. That's one way I think of planetary citizenship. So it's very local, but it's also always with the understanding of living on a planet. And then I just was here yesterday for the first part of my visit, and I saw this on this very building. And can you read it? In the back too? Maybe it's familiar to you. Maybe it's mysterious to you. Maybe it's like, oh, I've seen that every day. I don't even think I know what it means. But I want to ask, like, what does it mean to act as a universal body? Well, this suggests that there's a universal mission. Wow. Well, what might that be? I would propose that if it involves living on this planet, it might involve harmonizing our human systems with the planet. At least that, right? And it's worldwide. It's a network of local communities, but it's also happening worldwide, seeking to serve others across the world. So it clearly entails justice, right? So somebody here was thinking in those directions, I would say. And I would say planetary politics is very individual in the sense that we all bring our individual perspectives and gifts. For some of it means becoming a kindergarten teacher. For some of us, it means working for the United Nations. Perhaps it's being a singer. Perhaps it's, being a chef. Whatever it is, like the theologian Frederick Bruckner says, that your calling is the place where your deep joy meets the world's great hunger. Yeah. So that seems like a good place to start for planetary citizenship. So yeah, I think we are waking up to living on a living planet with all that that means, with all the terror and the wonder of that. And to acknowledge that if we're sitting in this room, most likely our ancestors did not live here centuries ago. So Brian began us with a land acknowledgement, which happens so often now that it can seem almost rote, but it's actually quite profound, I think, that today people all over the world, but especially in the colonizer countries, such as the United States, are beginning to wake up to this. And so there's a question, like, what is this awakening of indigenous wisdom? And I think sometimes it can carry a lot of guilt that, our forebears caused harm, but most likely they were fleeing harmful situations themselves. That often was happening. And if we're not really indigenous to the landscape in which we live, in what way are we indigenous? Does it make even sense for me to think of myself of an indigenous in any way? And I would propose that if you're a human being living on this planet, you are indigenous to planet Earth. So indigenous wisdom grew up in a very local context, and yet it shares some very common values and approaches to the world as understanding deep interdependence, a sense of humility, a sense of reciprocity, a sense of receiving the gifts of this earth and therefore giving back. And I would say that worldview, we can access it without necessarily being indigenous people, because we are actually indigenous to this earth. And the last thing I want to offer you before I end this portion of the talk and open it up to questions and answers is perhaps a kind of window into that. So, is it possible to lower the lights, Brian? I should have asked before, because you get a better sense of this. This is the Earth's atmosphere from outer space, and actually from orbit. So this is NASA photograph, and you can see the layers of the atmosphere here. There's the troposphere, which, by the way, is where we talk about climate change is happening. It's warming in the troposphere. The stratosphere, which is where the ozone layer is and protects us from ultraviolet radiation and does other things as well. Then the mesosphere, and then there's the ionosphere, and there's other aspects of the Earth's atmosphere. But the Earth is like, it's like a cell, in a sense, surrounded by the membrane of the atmosphere, protecting us as a cell's membrane does. And so we don't just live on Earth. I love this word that the writer David Abram invented, that we live in the earth. So put an I in the middle of Earth and you have the earth. And it's because the air is part of the Earth system. And so, so I'm going to actually invite us, if you feel inclined, to just close your eyes for a moment. And this will just take a couple minutes, but I'm hoping to give you maybe a slight visceral experience of what it means to live not just on the Earth, but in the Earth system. Because as they say, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the ground beneath our feet. So actually noticing the ground beneath your feet. Notice that your feet are planted on the ground. Or maybe they're not, but some part of you is. Your butt is certainly planted on a chair. And to just notice the sensation of your own weight on this planet. Perhaps you notice a settling. If you want to deepen into that experience, you could take a nice inhale and then let it go slowly and feel that settling into the gravitational force field of the earth. And notice that this thing we call gravity is actually not a thing, it's actually a relationship. It's a relationship between your own body and the body of the earth. And that in fact you're being held here every moment of your life, from your birth to your death. You're held here, you're tethered to this earth. Gravity is almost like an umbilical cord. And notice what happens in your whole system, in your nervous system, and perhaps your emotions, and your somatic resonance with this experience. What happens for you if you let yourself simply be conscious of your weightedness on the earth, in the earth system? And in fact, you can notice your breath. And simply noticing the breath, for many people, gives a sense of calm. And that this air that you're breathing in has circulated through the bodies of countless beings. It's circulated through the entire geosphere, atmosphere, biosphere, and into this quiet space. Recall that you're living on a living planet at the dawn of the Anthropocene. And just ask yourself, knowing that you can return to this question because it's a big question, but you can return to it at will. Who am I in this hinge moment of the human endeavor? Who am I at the dawn of the Anthropocene? What do I have to offer? And just notice whatever comes. And now taking this experience a little deeper and doing this with closed eyes if you can, pay very close attention to the boundary between what you think of as your body and the outside of your body. So what's you and what's not you? You might bring your attention to the air on your hands or the clothing on your skin, and just putting aside all ideas and images of a separate body, go directly to your raw experience. You're not looking at your body to see where do you end and where does something else begin. Can you even find a clear boundary between me and not me? You might notice your breath again. As you breathe in, you're maybe taking something that's not me into me. When does that not me become me? Or is there really a difference? Do you find a kind of fluid movement of tingling sensations and perhaps no clear boundary? And this is just something to play with. It's just an invitation. But to notice that this air that you breathe and your very weightedness can be a resource for accessing your sense of being, your sense of living on a living planet. Breathing, pulsing, alive, tingling with sensation. Taking in air, giving out oxygen, giving out CO2, being part of a living system. And that perhaps this can enliven you. So Nick, when you're ready, if you could turn the lights back on. And as you're ready, those of you in the audience, just open your eyes gently when you're ready and see if you can sustain something of that experience as you bring your attention back into the room. And if you're feeling a little adventurous with that sense of amorphous boundaries, perhaps, just look at a neighbor, look around. So what happens when we intentionally let our boundaries soften and actually notice that we're part of something much larger than ourselves, and that we're doing that with each other? Actually, to sit in a room, a dark room with a bunch of strangers is an act of trust, you know. Yeah, so you can maybe just take a deep breath and let it out, and thank you for indulging me in this exercise. So I'm just going to suggest that as humanity becomes conscious of itself as a planetary body, because we are a planetary body, one species on this one Earth, we can expect to see the emergence of social and political forms that express this oneness. Our species is operating as a geophysical force, albeit unconsciously, and our inner lives seem to be playing catch-up with our technological creations. A global civilization will only be possible if we somehow learn to function as the collective mind for our Earth system. It's not so much a question of whether we will make it as a species. As an exceptionally weedy and brainy species, we will most likely adapt to whatever conditions we catalyze, at least in the foreseeable future. The real question is what kind of species we will be and at what level of organization. And I think that's really important. Ultimately, this is a question of consciousness translated into politics and lived moment to moment in our everyday lives. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. So that was fantastic. Thank you so much. We are super chill now. Everybody fall asleep now, hopefully.
Yeah, if you took a nap, that's great,
A little
actually.
bit. So while you're thinking of questions, and I'm going to look online to see if any, I want to kick us off. So start thinking about what question you might want to pose. I've got a couple in my head. So the first one I'm going to pose is about Thomas Berry, you mentioned. He's a theme running throughout a lot of our events this year. Mm-hmm. We started last semester with an event on rights of nature, which was a topic that Thomas Berry was advocating earth jurisprudence as an idea as well. You do international politics, international law. I was curious on your ideas about rights of nature in general. Just with a brief context, it seems like a rights view is sort of an individualistic view, not a holistic, organismic. It's my rights against yours or your rights against mine, and so we can include more individuals. So is that the right model? I'm just curious.
The right model. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So my own sense is, like, I'm an advocate of, I'm fairly pragmatic, and so there's a way in which I would say kind of take whatever works, and also acknowledging that the way social change happens is it's an evolutionary process, and the way evolution happens is through a process of transcending and including. And so, for instance, we have a capitalist, highly rapacious capitalist economy. Can it possibly be greened? Well, can we even have a green economy under capitalism? Well, we're only going to know that if we start trying to green capitalism. In the same way with the rights of nature, it's a kind of comes out of an individualistic worldview, and yet if it can be useful in leveraging us in a more holistic direction, I think it's absolutely a great thing. And so, in fact, I think we have many tools in the old system. There's somebody out there who says you can't dismantle the system with the master's tools, and I actually disagree with that. I think if you're really good with the master's tools, you can you can dismantle the system.
So my question was a little bit less actually about, not quite on topic, but you mentioned your book, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the eco-villages and what the kind of basis behind that was.
Yeah, great. I suspect that I wrote that book for people like you who have that question, in particular because I realized that my students were just really hungry for something that actually works. And it also occurred to me that if there's this basic worldview of interdependence that needs to be lived in the world, and it's clear that this is what's needed, is there anybody out there that's actually doing it? And so in eco-villages, they're so diverse. They're all over the world. So they're like in every religion. And plus, secular and not religious, and spiritual and not religious. And they're in rural areas and urban areas. So they're quite diverse. But I would say that there is this common worldview. And so I think as a social scientist, if I can find people all over the world who are instantiating a common worldview and doing it in very diverse ways, just like the saying on your building, universal mission and locally implemented, but also globally connected. That's actually a really important phenomenon. So just very basic things, growing and tending to their own food needs. That's a piece of it. And having some cyclical understanding of water usage. So rainwater harvesting, very common. Organic wastewater treatment is also very common. Moving away from fossil fuels, both in energy needs in homes, but also in transportation. And most important, and I'm very interested in the social and the intersubjective nature of sustainability, like sharing as much as possible, which requires trust. And also moving out of the global economy. So for instance, in the US eco-villages, when I was doing this research, that was more than 10 years ago, but some of these eco-villages, the average income is less than $10,000 a year. So how are they finding ways to be happy and live in solidarity with minimal consumption? So yeah, does that help?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Oh, nice.
I appreciated your talk about eco-anxiety and everything, and I think that one of the biggest problems of it, and also an obstacle to thinking planetary, is the part of the population that completely disregard climate and the environment as a problem. So I guess as a social scientist, how do we bring those people into the conversation of thinking planetary? I know it's kind of difficult to bring those people in, but I just would be interested to hear your ideas.
Yeah. So I think there's a number of ways of going at that. One is to develop a sense of community and connection amongst people that can support you in your understanding of the world. So that's really important. And then one of the things that always has kind of struck me is that I remember during the time when there was a lot of climate denial, which there isn't so much even amongst Republicans anymore. So climate denial was a real big issue. And it always it would occur to me people are so concerned about climate denial when actually something between 70 and 80% of Americans believe that climate change is real and it's human induced, but actually most of them don't do anything about it. So I don't actually focus on the people who are denying the reality of climate change, for instance. I actually focus on the people who believe it's real, believe it's important, and feel paralyzed for whatever reasons. So I think that's a much more accessible audience, and you're more likely to find success, by engaging that audience. And there's one thing I would say in the last 5 years amongst young people is it used to be that I'd have to, particularly with environmental studies students, you might have found the same thing, John, that you kind of have to persuade them that politics was important. That they believe that somehow, if you want to work on climate change, you just, don't eat at McDonald's and ride a bicycle or, never take a hot shower or whatever. Basically individual action. But I think one thing that's happened in the last 5 years is people understand that politics is important. And that's actually social progress. Does that help?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have a question from a listener at home.
Oh, good.
Always wanted to say that. That sounds good. So Laura Feldman from Portland says, I rankle when you state that we didn't mean to create the Anthropocene in the way that we have, that it was an accident. I disagree, and that once we found out that we had gone too far, caused immense suffering, we have not changed our behavior largely. That needs to be included in the Gaia story.
I agree. It's true. It's true. We have known, well, the term Anthropocene is just maybe 20 years old at the most. So it's just come into the horizon. But, you know, I've been teaching, as I said, climate politics since 1988. And, you know, in 1988, the World Congress of Climate Scientists said that we needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think, immediately by 60%. So that was like 34 years ago. So yeah, we have known this. And part of me is, you know, empathic, like, okay, this is we're facing like, you know, centuries of growth economy and conquest orientation towards the earth and all of this. And so it's a lot to expect that people are going to simply turn on a dime. And there, at the same time, there has been a lot of misinformation, particularly from the fossil fuel companies. They know it. And so I agree, Linda. I think that's an important point, and I wish I had said it myself.
I'm going to put a question in the mouth of my colleague, Dr. Gordon. You're welcome. One of your favorite cartoons, Pogo. I'll let you say the line since it's your favorite cartoon.
We have met the enemy and he is us. It was the landmark cartoon for the original Earth Day in 1970.
So we've met the enemy and he is us. So that's my setup for the question, which is why not say, rather than being indigenous, or if we are, we're cancers. So what do you say to the misanthrope who is saying, right, we're an evolutionary experiment gone awry, and we're in the process of causing our own extinction and bringing lots with us?
Well, I think that's a story that we write. And so the story hasn't been written yet. And so I guess it's a question of like, where do you want to place your own life in the writing of that story? So we aren't extinct yet. There's 8 billion of us. And I don't think extinction's in the cards in the next few decades, although it's possible. If we have an all-out nuclear war and there's a nuclear winter, we will definitely, almost certainly go extinct.
But are we the enemy?
But you know, here's the thing. I really like this line from Walt Whitman, I contain multitudes. Yeah, I mean, heck, is there any of us who's not, you know, an over-consuming in some way or another? If we have the opportunity, you know, and it's something that we need to face. But is to reduce ourselves to just that? No, I mean, I think at the same time, we are all those people who are pouring their lives, especially, into ameliorating these problems. They're part of the Earth system also, a kind of, you know, immune response on the part of the Earth system saying, you know, like, we need to protect life, including the life of future human generations. So, yeah, I mean, I think you can get very misanthropic if you pay too much attention to what's going on in the world from a particular perspective. And I personally think we're an awesome species with a lot of unrealized potential. And, you know, so much of our behavior, I would say, comes from a disconnect from the earth. That if we actually felt ourselves to be part of the living earth, we wouldn't behave the way that we do. And that we go around with, so many of us, particularly in this kind of society, we're comfortable, we have enough, but we don't have any sense of sufficiency. And part of the idea with the meditation that I offered was that a sense of sufficiency is actually available to most of us most of the time at any moment. And if we could tap into that sense of sufficiency, I think we would not be behaving the way that we do. Oh,
Well, you know, I'm thinking about the way that you talked about how we create our own world in a way. The noosphere is a way we tell a story that creates a version of the world. And so much, you mentioned Ukraine, and so much of the world right now is focused on Ukraine and the war there and the threat of war and aggression, and particularly nuclear war and nuclear destruction, which you also mentioned. And I'm wondering if there's a way that one story can blend into another. And do you see any possibility that maybe where the world's focus right now might go might be that particular issue about war and nuclear destruction, and whether there's a way in which that story could somehow springboard to other planetary issues?
Yeah. I think the Ukraine war is, the invasion of Ukraine is really a kind of inflection point, and it could go in a lot of different directions, and you can feel all the different players trying to make the story their own, including the fossil fuel industry. It's like, okay, we're going to be having a shortage, so we need to drill more, and you see that happening. And at the same time, you see what's happening with the eco-villages that I mentioned. And also, and I think this is not to be underestimated, the sense of inspiration that a lot of people have felt in the courage and the deep humanity of the Ukrainian people. And I mean, who would have thought 2 months ago that Biden would get a standing ovation from both parties at the State of the Union address? And that was all about Ukraine. So I think this is, we're actually looking at an inflection point. And I will say, prior to writing my dissertation on the ozone treaties, I was actually studying nuclear strategy in the Cold War. And when the Cold War ended, like international relations scholars said, wow, how did that happen? We didn't see that coming, which is true, we didn't. So surprise happens, that's one lesson. But the other lesson is that there was a kind of triumphalism that came after the Cold War, and a sense of like, oh, capitalism has won out. And that was dangerous. And very little was actually done with nuclear weapons, and the issue simply disappeared. So actually what I see is that there's unresolved trauma in the world that's getting played out on so many fronts right now. It's being played out, I would say, on race issues, on patriarchy. It's being played out with the unresolved conflicts around the Cold War and nuclear weapons. So it's almost like, we are living in apocalyptic times. And apocalypse doesn't mean the end of the world. Apocalypse means the lifting of the veil. And so the veil is being lifted on every single thing that divides us. And the Cold War wasn't over, and we were not victorious, and it's still in some ways we see now going on. So everything that was unresolved then is still haunting us, for better or worse. And I think, as you're suggesting, that we, if we use this geopolitical moment well, it actually could point us in a much better direction.
So we have a question from Kendra, who's in Kansas. Kendra asks, how does energy and quantum physics fit into the idea of the new human? I believe the example of redefining what it is to be human, I suspect. Easy question. I feel like you might have been getting at this at the end of your talk with the softening boundaries discussion.
Well, this is definitely above my pay grade, I'll say that. But I will say that part of the reason that I think that the meditative practices, the kind of thing that I offered you, this kind of thing is important, is that what's essential to the noosphere is human consciousness. And I'm intrigued by the possibility that it's consciousness all the way down. I don't know that, and I don't have the physics background to be able to prove that at all. But what I do know is that in my own life, the capacity to become aware of everything that's in my experience, to the extent that I can, is what helps me move it to the next level of my own development. And I believe that when we do that together, we also have that possibility to do that socially as well. So I don't have a good answer to that question, but I think it's a great question.
I would recommend maybe the book that Thomas Berry and Brian Swim co-authored, The Universe Story. Swim is a theoretical physicist, and Berry is a cultural historian to Kendra in Kansas. If you're interested in the physics wrapped into this a little bit,
Right.
that might be one place to begin.
Yeah, and if you have some physics literacy and you're willing to wade into some deep social science theory, I would recommend Alexander Wentz, Quantum Social Science, where he draws out the implications of quantum mechanics for the social sciences. Yeah.
We have time for maybe one more question from the room, if there is one. Dr. Gordon, it looked like you started raising your hand now. You already asked your question, that's right.
You asked it for me, but I would encourage you to read the full comic in context. Because it's not necessarily.
I didn't let you do that, no. One more question, if there is one.
So, do you have any tips for people who are new to mindfulness practice and potentially ways they can do that makes them feel connected to our living planet locally? Because I think if you engage in mindfulness at the global level, it can induce more anxiety than peace. And so how can we engage in mindfulness to sort of expand our awareness of what's living without being overwhelmed?
Thank you so much. So, my field is international relations, international law, so I tend to go big, and I have an affinity for the stratosphere, so. But yeah, actually I think the microscopic piece of this is really important. And so the breathing and the somatic experience of gravity you can access anytime, anywhere. I also think it's really important to connect to the earth locally in our own backyard, literally. It's not like some people say, oh, I love to go out to nature. Well, where are you not in nature, right? And so just stopping and seeing beauty, listening, listening for the birds this time of year, feeling the cool wind on your face, feeling the sensuous vibrancy of the living earth is really important. Feel the sun when it comes out, and actually tap into that experience as an experience of the living earth, and not just like, oh, I want to get a suntan or whatever, it's like really, really feel that earthiness of yourself. And if you're interested in movement practices, which I find very nourishing for my system, I'll say that these practices are for bringing coherence to our own nervous system in pretty incoherent times. And so, like finding the fluid movement of your body, in the undulation of your spine, in the watery nature of your muscles and your skin, don't be afraid to touch your skin. All the elements of your body come from the earth system, from the earth, We are earthly beings, we just have kind of forgotten. The modernity in some ways has been a great forgetting. And at the same time, we're the beneficiaries of that. We've gotten so much comfort and convenience, but at some point, we realize that this is utterly unsustainable. So, and the extent to which we can come together at higher and higher levels of social organization is the extent to which we're going to make it as a civilization, and I would say probably as a species as well. Does that make sense?
That's a great note on which to end. Let's thank Dr. Litfin one more time. Thank you so much. If you go to our website at gonzaga.edu/climate center events, you can find out more information about future events. We hope to see you at those in the future. We are sort of a network around the world. There are hundreds of people right now watching us from these remote locations, and so It's exciting to be here with you in the room, and all of you all around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see you at another event soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.